So, thanks for everyone being here. Thank you to everyone on the panel for being prepared to do this, to all the expert witnesses. We feel really strongly about this, and it's actually, it's a very moving day for us. It's now almost a year to the day that Abba Boyd was murdered, and things haven't gotten that much better. Many things have been placed into position, but as you'll hear from the expert witnesses, there's still a lot of work to be done. We also had, some of the panelists had to cancel for various reasons, deaths in the family, other commitments. Lisa Crane is going to do the timekeeping, and we've got a lot to get through, so we also ask people to then just try and be as short and succinct as possible. Thank you. Let's start.
Sure. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I'm Frank Quintana. I'm the founding pastor of a new faith community here in Albuquerque called Blessed Oscar Romero Catholic Community. And it's a faith community committed to peace and justice issues. I was ordained to the priesthood in 1975, and I've served most of my ministry all of my ministry as in service to and an advocate for the LGBTQ community, for people homeless or nearly homeless, who were persons living with HIV/AIDS. I come to this panel because I also advocated and served those who suffered with addiction and other comorbidities with HIV/AIDS. And I also served as a hospice chaplain and ministered to those facing death and their families, and ministered to those on staff at hospice. And so those are the reasons why I'm here, to serve and advocate for the LGBTQ community and for the homeless.
My name is Marga Lopez. I'm an organizer with the Answer Coalition and WORD, which is Women Organized to Resist and Defend. I'm here today to hold the police of Albuquerque accountable for their acts of brutality against the people. The wealthy and their capital should not be valued above all others, and to me, this is unacceptable, and policing is a completely misguided concept that's not in the interest of the people. Nationwide, our police systems are being militarized beyond belief, which is something that we should remember is not separate from the military-industrial complex that carries citizens of ours overseas to engage in acts of violence against the impoverished people of other countries. As a woman, knowing about the feminization of poverty and the acts of discrimination and cruelty done to the poor by police, that breaks my heart. Women face beatings and harassment by the police for working as prostitutes or trying to find places to sleep, or even just simply because they're transgender or women of color. So I hope today to bring APT to justice and to further the awareness that these issues are nationwide and not just in Albuquerque.
I'm Charles Powell. I am a father and grandfather, and my main work nowadays is with Veterans for Peace. I'm a peace activist. I also belong to the Albuquerque chapter of the NAACP. And I'm a strong labor activist. I'm very concerned in advocating for peace and justice. I've lived in Albuquerque for over 29 years, and in the entire time that I've been here, police overuse of force has been a problem. And from time to time, I've become active on that issue, trying to get something done about it. And this time around, for a while, I was optimistic that we were going to get true reform. But I was very disappointed in the DOJ's finding because of some of the things that were missing. Most importantly, there were no findings in regard to race. And I think that that's a serious problem, and that's why I wanted to be here today.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eleanor Chavez, and I grew up in Santa Fe, and I've been living in Albuquerque since about 1981. I have spent most of my life organizing workers and organizing in my community, organizing healthcare workers, public employees, and now currently education employees. I work for the American Federation of Teachers. I have 4 kids. They all grew up in Santa Fe, and I remember when my sons especially were teenagers and, you know, going out, my biggest concern and fear was that they would be stopped by the police and injured or arrested. And I continue to have that concern for many of the young men in our community, but also our girls as well, our women as well. I mean, when we think about the women who were lost for so many years up on the West Mesa, and nobody really cared about them, and really, what does that say about our community? I'm here because I want to hear a little bit more about what's going on. I haven't been, as involved as some of you have been, and this is one way that I feel like I can contribute and raise my voice and help everyone in Albuquerque also organize around this issue and continue to raise the concerns and push the Albuquerque Police Department to be the kind of a department that responds to our community and our needs.
Good afternoon. My name is Sam Gardapi, and I'm a Pawnee Sac and Fox from Oklahoma, but I grew up here in Albuquerque, and I've always been an advocate for Native rights, as well as homeless people, which a large majority of them are Native. I used to live in Kyle, South Dakota, and when I came back down here in '08, the first thing I noticed was there's a lot of homeless here, and it kind of made me wonder because where I lived, there wasn't a whole lot, and so I thought, well, don't they have facilities here that help them, like soup kitchens or shelters? And I asked around about that, and it didn't seem like they had too many. So I've always wanted to work for people's rights, and so I got involved with the Answer Coalition, and then we also wanted to work on Native issues. I also am a member of the Red Nations here in Albuquerque. Thank you.
I'm Sally Alice Thompson, and as a member of Veterans for Peace, I'm a very strong proponent of nonviolence. And when the police use violence, either psychological or physical, against the people, it's a violation of our rights to to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. You don't have much happiness to pursue when somebody's beating you over the head or knocking you down on the sidewalk. And I believe that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness should be the rights of everybody, regardless of their financial situation, their racial background, their sexual orientation, anything. If human beings should have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you.
So in the first section, the Tribunal's political framework and methodology, Alan Wagman will give us an overview of the DOJ, etc. Thanks, Alan.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, members of the Tribunal. My name, as mentioned, is Alan Wagman. I'm an assistant public defender. I was on the Police Oversight Task Force while it was operating to recommend an ordinance for civilian police oversight. The people in this community have known for a long time what the problems were with APD, no matter how much the political leadership in the mayor's office and city council tried to deny it or ignore it. The fact, to the extent that anything is being done, it has been because of political pressure from the people in this community. To the extent that anything will be done in the future, it will be not by civilian police oversight, not by the Department of Justice, not by a lawsuit, not by the federal court. It will be as a result of political pressure from the people in this community. That is the only thing that will work. As for civilian police oversight, the council last year passed an ordinance that was better than the old one, which is a very low bar and very faint praise. But when it came to really giving the civilian oversight process any real authority or any real opportunity to examine the full range of police practices, City Council blinked. The Police Oversight Task Force asked City Council to allow the Civilian Oversight Board Police Oversight Board to look into every kind of police practice and analyze every kind of police practice. Handling of mentally ill, handling of race, handling of economic and sociological disability, handling of people with disabilities. And City Council's ordinance basically limited the Oversight Board to auditing, complete auditing of use of force only, and limits the Oversight Board's authority to look into other issues and analyze other issues. Even if City Council, and I point this out to show that City Council is not acting to the full extent of its ability, but even if it were, the most effective civilian police oversight in the world is ineffective unless the people running the police department and in the administration really want to see policing change. And it's clear they don't. As for the Department of Justice, they examined use of force. I don't know everything they examined, but the only findings they made really involved use of force. And the Department of Justice in the lawsuit is pushing for a change in the way the Albuquerque Police Department deals with use of force. They did not, the Department of Justice did not make findings about race, in particular, as mentioned, and we'll stick with even that issue. So the Department of Justice is not they're not opposing. Some of there were organizations that filed amicus briefs and that were pushing for expansion of the settlement agreement to include issues of racial bias in policing. And the Department of Justice is not opposed to that, but is not supporting that either. And the reason they're not supporting it, it's a technical legal argument. They're correct in their technical legal argument. And I want to say that I don't condemn them for this, but I do want to point out this is what makes a technical legal lawsuit not the answer. I'm a lawyer, and lawyers solve very little. The people solve everything. The reason that DOJ is not supporting an increase or an expansion of the settlement agreement to include race is that the lawsuit that the DOJ filed was based on use of force. If there is a violation of something involving use of force, DOJ can then ask for an injunction against APD on use of force issues. Since DOJ did not make findings and submit them to the court on racial issues, even if there became clear evidence of racial bias, there's no basis within this lawsuit to address racial issues. The court could not issue an injunction against DOJ on racial issues. So even to the extent that the lawsuit, it does give the court the ability to mandate some kinds of change, it also limits the ability of the federal court to mandate other kinds of change. And the only change that could be mandated is what's in the DOJ findings. To address anything else is up to you. Also, the history of every lawsuit that DOJ has brought against every city and every police force in which there's been an action has shown that when there are city officials, mayors, police chiefs, police chain of command who want to change, change happens. When there are mayors and police chiefs and chains of command who do not want to change, DOJ lawsuits accomplish nothing. Nothing. It is not going to be a DOJ lawsuit that makes APD change. It's going to be political pressure from the people of this city, making the leadership of this city change, making the leadership of this city want to change. You cannot rely on police oversight. You cannot rely on the Department of Justice. You cannot rely on a federal court. They help. They are not answers. The answer is political. And it's clear that presently neither the city, the executive branch, nor the legislative branch of the city is really interested in real change. The city council has passed an ordinance that is essentially weak. It does not allow investigation of anything beyond, much investigation of much beyond use of force in terms of doing policy analysis. One of the big issues overall is use of lapel cameras, which is really, really important. And I wrote an amicus brief for the Public Defender Department in which I quoted Scott Greenwood, the city's attorney, as having said in previous years that it was absolutely essential that police use their cameras every single time, because if they have to think about, do I use it now or is this excluded, they will not be able to remember when to do it. It has to be done every time so it becomes automatic. At a hearing of organizations that filed briefs with the court, I pointed that out to the judge, that Mr. Greenwood had said that. If the city were really committed to change, Mr. Greenwood would have stood up and said, yes, he's right. Instead, Mr. Greenwood stood up and said, when I said that, I was working for somebody else.
Oh.
Now, there's nothing wrong with Mr. Greenwood speaking as an attorney for the person for the people he happens to be representing at the time. But it's clear from that statement that the city of Albuquerque does not want its police officers to be required to use their lapel cameras. And it's clear that Chief Eden, based on remarks that Robin Hammer made to the Police Oversight Task Force, that Chief Eden is at minimum reluctant to discipline officers who don't turn on their cameras. On this one issue, the civilian oversight cannot make Chief Eden discipline officers for failure to turn on the cameras, and Scott Greenwood has made clear that the city doesn't care whether they turn on their cameras or not. Neither the lawsuit nor civilian oversight is going to resolve that issue or issues like it. It is going to be up to you. It's going to be up to political pressure. It's going to be up to the people of this city to do it. Thank you.
The next person is David Correa.
Thanks, Ilsa, and thank you, Alan. That's an excellent segue into what I'll be briefly talking about. I'd like to provide a few remarks to explain the rationale and the design of the methodology for the investigative report that you have in front of you. And for those of you here who are unfamiliar, this tribunal is the culmination of a 6-month investigation by activists and organizers with ABQ Justice and the Answer Coalition. And it came out of a profound disappointment with the lack of focus by every previous investigation of police violence in Albuquerque with the question of racial bias and other forms of prejudice in police violence. As Alan just pointed out, there's a reason for why the DOJ chose not to focus on this issue, and in private meetings with the investigators with the DOJ, they're content to admit that there is a problem with racial bias at the Albuquerque Police Department, but it did not figure whatsoever into their investigation. And there's more than just a technical legal problem with that choice. What it's ended up doing is lent credibility to claims by the mayor that racism has nothing to do with police violence in Albuquerque. This is a claim that the mayor has publicly made. This is a claim that the chief administrative officer, Rob Perry, has made. This is a claim that officers have made to me. And so 6 months ago, and particularly, by the way, after calls for people and groups like Jewel Hall with the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Center, who has been, I think, a key figure in demanding that the Department of Justice and the city administration take race seriously in this problem. And their failure to do so convinced us that we were going to have to launch our own investigation. We were going to have to launch our own investigation to do precisely what every previous investigation has not done, and that is figure out precisely what is, how racial bias gets expressed in the forms of police violence practiced on the people of Albuquerque. So that was the rationale for this report, and 6 months ago, we decided at ABQ Justice and Answer to begin to design an investigation that included extensive street outreach. For all the good work the investigators in the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice did in their investigation, none of that work included street outreach. They didn't go out and talk to the people who are the victims of police violence. They relied on APD's self-reported data on use of force. And they held 3 public meetings where anyone could come, but they did not go out and look for the people who were too scared to make complaints, or who didn't know there was a process to make complaints, or who just didn't think it was worth it because no one would take them seriously. So instead of relying on the same methodology that the Department of Justice relied on, or that the Walker-Luna report in 1996 relied on, or even the Police Executive Research Forum in 2011 relied on, we took for granted that APD underreports their use of force, and we went out into the community to see if we could prove that. And over the course of 6 months, we interviewed scores of people. As you know, in front of you in the report, there's a section on methodology. Of the, I would estimate, at least 100 people that we approached, 41 were willing to talk to us in extended interviews. And so these were open-ended interviews on the street. Kathy Brown will talk more about this later in particular. And what we found in doing this was that it was almost universal, that homeless people, people of color, particularly Native Americans, are targeted, and women are targeted by the police. And all of those, almost all of those attacks went unreported. None of those people either felt safe to report it, believed it would have any value, or even knew there was a complaint procedure. And lastly, let me just end by saying that this is, I think, primarily one of the reasons. The effectiveness of this method led us in one of our expectations at the end of the report to recommend that without street outreach, without a team of investigators scouring the streets, particularly in the areas of town we selected, downtown, the International District, UNM, and the area around the Alvarado Transportation Center. If we're not engaged in street outreach in those areas, we are always going to miss the pattern and practice of police violence in Albuquerque, and the police will be able to continue to underreport their use of force. Thank you very much.
So the second section of the program is police violence in historical and contemporary context. And Richard Moore is the first person to speak, please. Thank you.
Good afternoon, sisters and brothers. I wanted to speak, if I can, briefly about some of the historical activities that have taken place throughout the years here in Albuquerque in regards to the Albuquerque Police Department. I just wanted to, just to say this before I begin this testimony, that after recently returning from Selma, Alabama, I just came back from Selma, and the inspiration, just the morale and the spirit and the inspiration of our sisters and brothers, not only in the southeastern part of the United States, but from all over the country that were present in Selma, is what should additionally give us that same kind of spirit and inspiration to continue this struggle against police violence here in the city of Albuquerque in the state of New Mexico. As many of you know, 600 people marched 50 years ago across the bridge in Selma, Alabama, and over 100,000 of us marched over the last 3 or 4 days over that same bridge. That's the kind of spirit and enthusiasm of struggle that we need to continue to create here in the city. I also would like to thank those that are on the tribunal and also those that are present in this activity this afternoon. As was said, my name is Richard Moore. I'm here as a coordinator of Los Sardinas Institute, the Gardens Institute, and we're a citywide, statewide grassroots organization that works on agriculture, literacy, and environmental and economic justice issues here. Many of our sisters and brothers that are present in this room know that I've been active in the city of Albuquerque in the state of New Mexico for close to 50 years now, and police brutality, police repression is one of the issues that we've concentrated on. I just want to give us very quickly some examples of how this whole thing manifests itself. One, and I will only speak coming from the 60s and moving us forward here, but I think it's very, very important that we acknowledge those that were working on these issues in the 50s, in the 40s, and the 30s, before many of us began this process. in the late 1960s, we formed several organizations here in the city of Albuquerque, one being the Brown Beret organization. For many of us that come out of the Chicano movement and come out of liberation movements, at that particular point, the Brown Berets were formed after many of us returned back from the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C. in 1968. Also, some of us that left the Brown Berets and formed the Black Beret organization here, which was a Latino youth, not primarily youth, but largely youth organization that worked in many of the communities that surround us here in the North and the South Valley. Also, for those that are not knowledgeable, we formed UMAS, United Mexican American Students, on the campus in the 1960s of the University of New Mexico. Many of our sisters and brothers that were founders of Chicano Studies and many of the other organizations and activities that have taken place on the UNM campus. Additionally, just to run through that very, very quickly, I also was, after leaving the Black Berets, after we dismantled the organization, we formed the Chicano Communication Center in that period of time, and that was the coming together of several organizations, primarily Chicano organizations here in the city and the state of New Mexico. That's where 450 years of Chicano history, the publication, came out of during that time. After that, then some of us came together and we formed the Southwest Organizing Project, which is an organization that still exists in the city today. After that, several of us moved on and we formed the Southwest Network for Environmental and Economic Justice to concentrate not only in the state of New Mexico, but in this region, in this country, on issues of environmental and economic justice. And then additionally, that's what brings us to where we are today in Los Sardinas Institute. In the late 1960s, there was a killing that took place in the Old Town Plaza, and the young man that was killed during that time was Tommy Valles. And many of us protested for weeks upon weeks against the Albuquerque Police Department. And it became very obvious in terms of some of the police that couldn't handle themselves what was happening inside of APD. What I mean by that is that in the locker room of the Albuquerque Police Department, there was a police officer that made a statement that said, "When I see Tommy Valles, I'm going to kill that son of a bitch." And 2 or 3 days later, Tommy Valles was not only killed, but was assassinated in the Old Town Plaza. The city of Albuquerque chose, after testimony after testimony after testimony, to do nothing about that situation. I just want to say that in January 29th of 1972, 2 of our members were assassinated by the Albuquerque Police Department, Rito Canales and Antonio Cordova. That's a very, very important moment in history, not only in the city of Albuquerque, but in the state of New Mexico, so that we become aware that what's taking place in this city is not something that's new, but in fact has been going on for many, many years. We say that because, and we don't use the word assassination lightly, but we know that when in the Black Beret organization, when we created the community patrol, for those of you that are not knowledgeable, we formed the first community patrol in the city of Albuquerque, where our members traveled into communities of Martineztown, Los Parias, all over the North and South Valley, and so on. And many of the residents in these communities said to the mayor and to the police department, we would rather have the Black Berets in our community patrolling our neighborhoods than have the Albuquerque Police Department, and informed the Albuquerque Police Department to stay out of our communities, that the Black Berets will patrol the communities. Also, for your knowledge, we called on the city council for a police review board. I also have to inform you that at that particular time, we also provided information to the Attorney General of the state of New Mexico, David Norvell, during that time, that gave him a list of names of Albuquerque Police Department members, of Sheriff's Department members, and State Police Department members that were part of the Minutemen organization during that time. We infiltrated the Minutemen organization, and actually they were holding their meetings very close to where we are at in the North Valley of Albuquerque right now. And our folks infiltrated the organization and turned over the names of those police officers that were members of the Minutemen organization to the Attorney General's office. And the Attorney General and the governor of the state of New Mexico chose to do nothing about that. And they continued to kill us, they continued to assassinate us, they continued to brutalize us, and they continued to do the same kind of things that was taking place then that's taking place now in the city of Albuquerque. I just want to close and you know, by making, if I can, several comments here. There's no question that race and class plays a major factor in terms of what's been taking place in terms of police repression in this city, both historically and today. But at the same time, we cannot separate what's taking place, what had took place historically, and what's taking place now, and how that fits in to the general picture of where we are in the state, where we are in this region, where we are in this country, and where the situation is the world is present at now with the militarization of everything, from our schools, from our homes, or whatever. I just want to make these last couple comments to share with you. One, there's no disconnection when they blew up our cars, when they assassinated our members, when they killed, brutalized, and assassinated other people in this city of Albuquerque and the state of New Mexico. Felipe Gallegos was killed by the Taos Police Department. Cannot be separated, sisters and brothers, from what we're talking about today in terms of APD. They worked together hand in hand during that time. They had a special force that brought together the police departments of this city and this state to not only harass, but intimidate, but to brutalize and kill when necessary what took place in terms of political activity. Linda Montoya was killed by the Santa Fe Police Department in an alternative school in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Larry Casals was killed by the Gallup Police Department at so-called occupation of that sporting goods store and so on, the citizen's arrest that was attempted to be made in Gallup of the mayor. So I just want to close by saying this to you, that if we expect, as the previous people had spoke to, that the mayor of this city to do anything about this issue, or the governor, or in fact the city council, or in fact any other entity at that level, what we need to do is we need to stay on the street, sisters and brothers. I tell you that because we need to use all forms of possibility to bring this information to the public and for the public to decide how we're going to move forward in this situation. I will make these last closing comments. One, that racial profiling is not just an incident that's taking place. Unfortunately, history speaks for itself. The quota system that we've talked about. For those of us that live in the valley, you know if you're driving about the last 3 or 4 days of the month, and if you're doing any driving without a light, whatever it may be, then you're probably asking for it, no? Because they're going to go after us anyway because they're on a quota system. So I just want to finish by complimenting the panel. We had a People's Tribunal in the Black Berets. You need to understand that. We had hearings and tribunals in Martineztown, in Los Parias, and the furthest north of the valley of where we're at now to the furthest of the South Valley. Our community members participated in those. We went on radio and we went on TV. When our members were killed by the Albuquerque Police Department, the Metro Squad, they were to appear the next day on TV to testify against police repression and what was going on at the state penitentiary during that time. Our members were killed the day before that testimony was to be given on the TV stations. So I just want to close by saying we need to continue the struggle. We need to come together as sisters and brothers. We need to put some of our egos and some of our other things to the side. We need to continue to work to unify our communities and to unify this city. And until we do that, they will continue to kill us, they will continue to brutalize us, and in fact, then we will not be receiving the kind of justice that we need to be receiving. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Richard. The next speaker is Andrew Nance.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Nance, and I'm a member of the Answer Coalition and also an organizer within the Black Lives Matter movement. I really want to thank ABQ Justice for inviting me to speak today. I hope that my talk can help to put the struggle in Albuquerque in a more national context by really conveying my experiences as an organizer in LA. Since its inception, the people in this country have sort of seen the differences in skin tone and culture as a warrant for exploitation and dehumanization. Since its inception, the murder of people of color has seen no consequences in this country. So it should come as no surprise to see very high-profile cases end in acquittals in the absence of convictions. Nevertheless, these cases have sparked national outrage and ignited streets with fury of all nationalities declaring that Black Lives Matter. To understand this anger, we must closely consider the larger picture, a picture painted by the legacy of slavery and the habitual national oppression that confronts people of color. The Black community has the highest poverty rate, and nearly half of all Black children in America live in poverty. As a people, we are really suffocated by the mass media's showcasing of our natural features as undesirable or ugly, and the history that we're taught so conveniently excludes the contributions of people of color. America's notorious participation in slave labor sort of points to today's statistic that we make up 25% of the global prison population while only constituting a mere 5% of the world population. 2.3 million people are incarcerated in America, and roughly 1 million of them are Black, which I would like to point out is more people that were enslaved in 1850. The lack of jobs that possess a livable wage, the denial of adequate health care, the struggle to obtain a livelihood that many of us will probably never experience, presents the decision to either wither away or do what is necessary to survive. The measures we take and the measures that we must take under the circumstances that the system keeps us in are criminalized because the justice system is designed to work in favor of the security of the rich. And when we get out of jail, we are haunted by that section of the job application that inquires about our criminal history, and we have an inability to receive a loan for a home or a car. We cannot participate in voting. You know, America has been bred to associate melanin with crime, poverty, danger, ignorance, and lack of civility. All of these traits that nobody asks to be attributed to them make it all the more easier for other social groups to digest the systematic racism that plagues so many communities in this nation and the racist violence that ensues because of it. So many avenues in society hold down people of color, and particularly Black people, and the horrific and unjustifiable murders of Mike Brown and Eric Garner were the last straw. It took the loss of so many lives for us to finally regain the confidence to fight back, and as a result, we have the Black Lives Matter movement. Or rather, an uprising of a national community banded together despite their differences to declare that the state will no longer continue to pluck us off one by one without a fight. The driving force is that the people are simply fed up with the brutal racism that confront Black people and morally outraged at the murders of unarmed people across the country that are happening in their own neighborhoods, and that the killers responsible rarely ever get sentenced, you know? Take, for instance, Michael Dunn. A civilian, not a cop, and a member of a very small club of racists who went to jail after killing an unarmed Black person. Only Dunn wasn't sentenced for killing Jordan Davis. He was only found guilty of attempting to murder two of his friends that were with him on the last night of his life. Racism is alive and well, and white supremacy has existed far prior to the birth of America, and it would be foolish to believe that it does not exist today, and that it is not the source of many of the problems that the disenfranchised face. Unless, of course, you're anti-racist and you recognize the rampant discrimination that regularly confronts people of color and historically oppressed nationalities. Otherwise, you might see a reason for the disproportionate mass incarceration of Black and Latino people, as well as Native people. You might not be shocked to discover that many of the targets of the abominable police practices, including stop and frisk, broken window policing, gang injunctions, shoot first, ask later, are people of color. Time and time again, this justice system displays grave negligence to confront the racist reality of people of color. Just in LA, over 600 unarmed people have been killed since 2001, and 0 officers have been convicted for it. You know, police don't serve or protect the communities that they exist in. They really act as a tool to maintain the gap between the rich and the poor. And we can never forget that many of these killings are stemmed in racism, but at the same time, we cannot take police violence out of its proper context. The context in which very few extremely rich people enjoy their wealth that they've profited from the meager salaries of the workers, while a growing majority of us experience poverty. The case of James Boyd and Mike Brown no doubt have stark differences, but they are also very similar. The primary similarity is that they're not here today because of the way that the cops interact with these lower sectors of society, and the fact that the cops play this role whenever they confront people who are seen as sort of undesirable. And whenever their sort of ego is bruised. You know, a lot of cops have this sense of entitlement to the unconditional respect and obedience, even when they're humiliating and dehumanizing people in their own neighborhoods. You know, people rose up that were fighting. The people that rose up that were fighting for Mike Brown and Ferguson, they were also fighting for the justice for the other Mike Browns in the neighborhoods across the country. Just as Richard pointed out earlier, this has been going on for a very, very long time. And I would also just like to commend Albuquerque for rising up in unprecedented numbers and winning justice for James Boyd. I would hope that something like that can be replicated throughout the rest of the country. And I think that the death of Africa in LA, an unarmed homeless man suffering from mental illness who was shot while held down and surrounded by 5 police officers, all on tape, further demonstrates that point. You know, the point that the war on the police have waged on poor people in lower sectors of society is the same everywhere you go. And I think that his killing also bears a very strong likeness to that of James Boyd. Police militarization and mass incarceration does not stop crime. It destroys families and the futures and the solace that should exist in the immediate community surrounding your home. Meeting the people's needs stops crime. Give us a job with a livable wage so that we can actually survive and meet all of these other needs that you so conveniently hold away from us. A complete eradication of police violence will require measures taken far beyond legislation. We need an alternative to policing, and we need to chop from the cops, from their funding. We don't want funding for these killer cops in our neighborhoods. We want funding for schools, we want funding for job programs, and we want funding for after-school programs for our youth. We want dignity and self-determination, and Ferguson has really ignited the consciousness of black people and oppressed people all over the country and inspired a greater willingness to struggle, and it demonstrates the power of organizing to the people who are told every day that they have no alternative but to submit to the violent existing authority. You may be seeing less of the Black Lives Matter movement on TV now, and to some it may seem as though the movement is dying, but if you think that we're going to go back to being silent, you are making a sad, sad misjudgment. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kathy Brown. I'm a member of ABQ Justice, and I just want to give you a brief overview of how we collected these testimonies. And so what we did is we would gather. We had a meeting place. Generally, we met at the Fair and Square over on Central. Then we would split up into small groups, generally maybe 2 or 3 people per group. One person was generally doing the recording or the videoing. Overwhelmingly, the people who provided testimony were afraid. Every single one of them were afraid. When we told them about the tribunal and that we were gathering these stories, most of these people did not want to give their story. But then after we sat there and we talked to them for a minute, many of them agreed to tell their story. And when they did, you could see this emotion come up in them. as they were reliving these experiences. And many of them became angry. And many of them showed us scars on their head where their heads have been beat open, cracked open. And after they told these stories, you could see they were relieved. They thanked us. They hugged us. Some of these people cried. And they were very, very grateful to us for what we're doing here today. And as you listen to these testimonies today, I'm asking you to please keep in mind how afraid these people were to tell their stories. And we had to gain their trust. And to this day, many of them were, please do not use my name. Please do not use my face. And so I just want you to keep that in mind as you're hearing these stories today about how fearful these people were. One gentleman even went so far as to tell me that the police asked him one day where they could buy crack. And this guy says, I don't know. So he's over on Central. The police actually got on their PA system and said his name and thanked this man for providing them with information. And as we all know, that's asking for a death sentence out on the street. So keep in mind how afraid these people were as you hear these testimonies, please.
Hello, my name is Bernadette Garcia, and I'm a member of ABQ Justice. And I'm going to read some of the testimonials that we got from people who are on the street and who face APD daily. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Native Americans make up 8% of the population, but comprise nearly 2% of the victims of police violence, a rate greater than any other racial group. And while police kill young black men more than any other group, they kill Native Americans at a higher rate. I started at the wrong place. Okay. Nearly every Native person interviewed described APD's use of racial slurs such as dirty Indian. They described encounters that began with ABD officers telling them, go back to the reservation. One Native man reported, I was walking on the street and a cop was following me. I go down the alley and he'd follow me. Why don't you go back to the res? You're not welcome here in Albuquerque, he told me. A homeless Jicarilla Apache man pointed to the ground. This is ours, our land, he said. And the cops, they'll say things like, why do you want to bring the reservation our way? ABQ Justice investigators asked how often harassment is also violent. It's usually, he said, he showed wrists covered in scabbed over wounds he said were from handcuffs. He pulled off his sunglasses. One eye was red and swollen. They maced me in this eye. They walked up to me from behind and maced me like this, he said, as he put his hand inches from the interviewer's eyes to show how it was done. How common is this? Does this happen to everyone? Yes, he said. They handcuff you and then they beat you and then they take you to the hospital and say something like, we found him this way. A young Native woman was reluctant to talk to investigators, but finally described an incident that happened in the fall of 2014. This cop just drove up on me, got out and slammed my head into the pavement. Then he just got in his car and drove away. She was walking with a friend who described a constant pattern of harassment. We'll be waiting at the bus stop and cops will pull up and tell us to keep moving or they'll arrest us for loitering. A Navajo man in his 30s and a community college student at CNM described constant harassment. I go to school, CNM, I'm not in trouble or anything, you know, but they hassle me, called the gang unit and everything. They had me on my knees and my hands behind my back and everything. A Native woman described a practice. Other respondents described also APD officers arrest Native people in one part of town, take them to another part of town, and then release them. She said APD officers arrested her friend, drove her over to 9 Mile Hill, and then left her there. Investigators spoke to a Native man just blocks from the Albuquerque Indian Center. You know, I'm an alcoholic, and I drink on the streets. And the police picked me up, and they brought me all the way down to the biopark, and they beat me while I was in handcuffs, and then they handcuffed me and let me go. A homeless Native man reported being arrested for littering after he threw away his cigarette when officers told him to stop smoking. 2 Native men in their 20s reported being harassed by a police officer who claimed to be a military veteran. He tries to represent Marines. He's all "Oorah." He says he was there, he done it, and he's like to us, "How come you don't go and fight our war?" And we told him, "Why are you living in our world? This is our land." Then he just started checking IDs. He mostly harasses drunk people who can't ID him. Another Native man reported being beaten in November of 2014. I was walking. The officers dragged me on the ground and hit myself on the sidewalk on my shoulder. I can't tell you who the officers are. I was just walking. They threw handcuffs on me. I don't know what for. Thank you.
Sorry, do you want to introduce me? Was I next? I'm sorry, I'm so incensed and pissed off about those testimonies that were just shared that I wanted to come up here immediately and talk about it. So again, my name is Melanie Yazzie. I'm a PhD student in American Studies here at UNM. I'm also one of the founders of the Red Nation, the organization, we're not an organization, we're a collective, indigenous-led collective here in Albuquerque that's been active for the last few months. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Yep. Okay. I want to thank ABQ Justice for inviting me here to talk about police violence. On the program, I'm listed as talking about police violence against oppressed populations, poor populations, and poor populations of color. I'm just going to focus on Native violence because that's my specialty. And also, we live in Albuquerque, and as these testimonies, I think 2 or 3 of the folks who were interviewed and what was just shared talk about Albuquerque as indigenous space. We are on indigenous land, the history of colonialism here. The word colonialism needs to be used more when we talk about police violence in Albuquerque, and so we need to acknowledge that. I mean, we have several pueblos that continue to live and surround and constrain the ability of the city to grow, for example. There's a strong indigenous presence. There are 291 indigenous nations represented in the population of Albuquerque. If you didn't know that, that's massive. There are 55,000 Native people who live in Albuquerque, 35,000 of which come from my nation, the Navajo Nation. So I think that a focus on Native issues, specifically in the context of Albuquerque, is absolutely essential when we're talking about issues of police violence. I want to advance an identity, a political identity I have. I'm an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation. I don't say that very often because I don't think that the law is very helpful. I think the law is primarily violent in the way that it interacts with Native people. I mean, we're talking about the police, right, who are like the enforcers of violence primarily in the United States here at this tribunal. But the reason why I'm saying I'm an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation, and that's what who and how I represent myself today at this tribunal, is because that identity is vested in treaties. It's vested in the idea and the fact that Native people belong to nations, and these nations threaten the legitimacy of the United States, all of its institutions, and the citizens who claim same patriotic duty and affiliation with the nation state of the United States. Because the United States was founded originally and primarily, along with slavery, other sort of forced servitude, but at its foundational moment, the so-called discovery of the Americas was a colonial act. The expansion of capitalism into the Americas was about killing Native people. It was about stealing by force, Native land, and it continues to be a fundamental structuring element of how the United States relates with indigenous people. And the way that that relates to treaties is that treaties are violated constantly by the government, by its institutions, and by citizens. Treaties are violated. The status of indigenous nations as political entities that have political power and legitimacy is constantly domesticated, it's privatized, it's ignored, it's denied. And this has everything to do with the system of violence and the extreme system of violence that Native people continue to face all over the so-called United States, but definitely in a place like Albuquerque. And so when I call myself an enrolled member of the Navajo Nation, I'm invoking the treaty status of the Navajo Nation. I'm invoking the Navajo Nation as an actual indigenous nation that has political power. 35,000 of my fellow citizens, Navajo citizens, reside in Albuquerque. 10% of Albuquerque's population is Navajo, is my understanding. And so this is a Navajo space as much as it is any other space. And that's why I'm invoking that status. So thank you. So I wanted to give some statistics, some of which I think have already been given by previous speakers and then by the speaker before me with this testimony, but just to give you a sense of not just the disproportionate violence that Native people, not just in Albuquerque, but in the so-called United States experience, but the catastrophic level of violence, right? Disproportionate is not as serious as the word catastrophic or the level of crisis that Native people experience. So just to give you a sense of statistics, 78% of Native people don't live on reservations or trust lands in the United States. 78% of people. That means people living in Albuquerque, regardless of the fact that they're related to nation states, right? They live here in Albuquerque. So we have 55,000 Native people, 219 indigenous nations represented in Albuquerque. Along with African Americans, I'm not sure where the statistic lies because I'm bad at statistics, but Native people overall are the poorest demographic of people in the so-called United States. We experience twice the rate of violence, and when I talk about violence, I'm talking about police violence, sexual and gender violence, suicide, substance abuse, untreated mental health, right? All of these indicators of violence that come from poverty and also from colonialism, which I'll talk about here in a second or in a minute. We experience 45% unemployment rates in states like South Dakota, New Mexico, and Arizona. It's not a coincidence that there are large Lakota and Dakota land bases and large challenges to the legitimacy of the way that land and private property are run in these locations by Navajo people and Lakota and Dakota people. Native people, as was said earlier, experience incarceration higher than any other group in the United States. Native children experience post-traumatic stress disorder at the rate of veterans returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. From 1977 to 2013, the Native prison population in the so-called United States increased by 500%, along with many other populations. 13% of the homeless population in Albuquerque is Native. And in terms of healthcare, healthcare, right, is the indicator of life. It's the indicator of well-being and longevity, right? And so it's also an indicator of how violence impacts and impedes that. In the state of New Mexico, $2,849 is spent on Native health care per cap, so on each individual, by the Indian Health Service. Meanwhile, the national average in the United States is $8,895 per normal U.S. citizen, and in the state of New Mexico, it's $7,315 per inmate in New Mexico correctional institutions. And I forgot what the report is. My partner Nick is the one who does kind of all the statistical research. I do a lot of the analysis on colonialism. But it was found that the Native urban population in New Mexico, i.e. primarily the population in Albuquerque, has the worst health care of any population in the entire United States. And so that really tells you about the situation of violence and the extreme and catastrophic context of violence that Native people in Albuquerque experience. And in terms of police treatment of Native people, I only have a few minutes left. It's really characterized by intimidation, extreme brutality, and then this concept of an extrajudicial system. This is something the chair of my department kind of incorporated or talked to us about when we started to do the work on border town violence here in American Studies at UNM. And this idea of an extrajudicial system is really one in which sort of the common sense of colonialism, which is a common sense of anti-Indianism. It's a common sense that Native people must be disappeared constantly because we're attached to political entities that really fundamentally challenge the system of US supremacy, of US sovereignty, of US domination, right? The very existence of the United States, that this extrajudicial killing, that the police, even though they're part of the judicial system in the United States, that the police really enforce on the streets in a place like Albuquerque, and I'll describe how this happens, and I think you heard this in some of the testimony that was given right before I came up here. It's arbitrary, it's nebulous, it happens on the streets, it doesn't happen in institutions. It happens in back alleyways at night, it happens outside of the purview of the law. And the police and citizens both enforce this in Albuquerque. When we think about the killings of Cowboy and Rabbit, Allison Gorman and Key Thompson, two Navajo men who were brutally bludgeoned to death beyond the point of recognition. You know, last July, I think it was last July here in Albuquerque, what we're talking about, 2 minutes. What we're talking about is extrajudicial violence. And the fact that it doesn't happen within the purview of institutions, the fact that it happens all the time, creates a climate of fear and a climate of violence, where Native people in Albuquerque, much like what you just heard in that testimony, always have to be wary of violence coming from absolutely every direction, not just the cops in Albuquerque, right? And so it's this system, the colonialism creates this system in which if the common sense of the citizenship and of the state and its institutions and its primary arbiters and enforcers like the police force, if the system is premised on the disappearance and the killability, right, and the invisibility of Native people because we threaten the legitimacy of the system, the fundamental legitimacy of the system itself, then you understand why those levels of violence are so high, why they happen everywhere all the time. They can be spontaneous, instantaneous, and it's because they're structural, that it exists in such extreme forms. A Native person has to be disappeared, their presence has to be eradicated, right, in order for that legitimacy to constantly be reinforced and to constantly be reinscribed. Native people are seen as a threat, especially in a place like Albuquerque, where we're entirely surrounded by treaty lands, by indigenous nations, where 10% of our population is comprised of the largest indigenous nation in the so-called United States, right? And so this idea of containment, this common sense of containment, this common sense of extreme violence against Native people, that helps us to explain why that exists in such a profound way in a place like Albuquerque. And just to close, you know, there are also statistics and there are also reports that talk about the way that police, and this is part of the militarization of different sectors, so-called public sectors or service sectors in the United States, the way that police have in locations with urban locations with large Native American populations, how the police have been increasingly expected to perform the role of service provider, whether it's to mediate domestic violence services, family violence, mental illness or mental health issues, issues of sexual and gender violence, et cetera. And part of this is the confluence of the state, the colonial state, using police to violate treaties because those services are actually premised on treaties. If you ever look up the history of treaties, we have 291, because we have 291 indigenous nations represented in Albuquerque. You have 291 treaties that are constantly violated, that are never enforced, that are completely ignored. And those treaties have written in them the funds and the services that are supposed to be provided to Native populations. So why in the hell do Native people in a place like Albuquerque have the worst health care of any other population in the country? It's because of colonialism. It's because of anti-Indian common sense. And the Red Nation is trying to work on these issues. We're trying to mobilize and work with poor Native populations, particularly urban populations. And we're excited to be involved in this process and to collaborate with other people. And we also ask that you understand our issues and that we all work together to help poor Native people in this city stop dying, because they die every day. And we're holding a similar event to this in Gallup on April 4th. I can tell you more about it if you want, to recognize the 176 Native, primarily Navajo people who have died unnatural and brutal deaths there, much in the same way that all of these people on this wall have here in Albuquerque. Yeah, thank you.
Brown is going to read some excerpts from the
Sure. I just wanted to ask you if maybe you could link these acts of racist violence to other instances that happen nationwide with Indigenous people or just in general. Obviously, Mike Brown would be an example of that. And then maybe if you might say something about other Indigenous resistance movements that are combating this sort of violence around the country.
It's like there are 3 parts to the question, so if you can remind me as I go through this. I'll answer the last one first, just because that's the one that's freshest in my mind, and I didn't have time to say that during my testimony. Part of what we're doing with the Red Nation here in Albuquerque is we're actually trying to continue and build on a history of resistance in the American Southwest that really started in the 60s and 70s around violence against urban Native populations, primarily populations in places like Gallup and Farmington. I'm thinking about National Indian Youth Council. I'm thinking about the Coalition for Navajo Liberation, right? And these groups, which were an instrumental part of the ascendance of indigenous-led and treaty-led sort of political activism in the United States, were specifically around this issue. And so there's a long history of this. I'm not really sure of other groups that are doing it from this perspective, meaning like we're indigenous nations, we have political power, we have treaties, you need to fucking honor that, right? And we actually need to be able to enforce these in the context of municipal government, state governments, as well as the federal government. In terms of stuff that's going on elsewhere in the country, I'm not too familiar. I mean, I think we've been fighting so hard just to try to get a foothold here locally in places like Albuquerque and Gallup especially, which is where most of our work is going on. I am sure that there are other groups that are doing this work in places like Minneapolis, places like Denver and Los Angeles, but we just haven't made connections, so that's something I need to become more informed about. And you were talking about the relationship between violence here and violence against other populations, sort of targeted populations in the United States. I mean, the gentleman who came up here earlier and talked about the Black Lives Matter movement, and then there was a hashtag that was started called Native Lives Matter. I don't know if you guys paid attention. And the Native Lives Matter hashtag, or a sort of nebulous movement, I'm not really sure if it's an actual movement, was also piggybacked off of the increased media attention to police brutality against black and brown bodies, and then talking about police brutality against indigenous bodies, particularly in places like border towns. And we need to talk more about border towns. Albuquerque's a border town. I can talk more about that later. If anybody has any more specific questions, I don't want to take up a bunch of space. But I think the idea of disposability and the value or the lack of value that's assigned in general to racialized populations is one very important way in which we can make connections between Black, brown, and indigenous experiences, as well as gendered and sexual experiences with police brutality. And I will say one caveat: when we talk about race violence against Native people, you can't just talk about race. You have to talk about colonialism, right? And that has a very specific connotation when you talk about indigenous people, because colonialism is not just about the oppression of Native people, it's actually about the disappearance of Native people. And I think those have very different sort of trajectories that are obviously related to other populations of oppression, but that's a distinct category when we talk about Native people. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Did you have other aspects to your question? I don't remember.
That was good.
Okay.
Else had
Thank you.
I'm going to talk about I'm going to read from this report about the harassment of homeless people. Our investigation reveals that the Albuquerque Police Department specifically and routinely engages in the harassment of homeless people. Those patterns of harassment regularly include the intimidation, threats, and frequently unjustified non-lethal force. A homeless Hispanic male in his 50s told investigators, "When a cop comes up to me, I get scared. They always make an excuse. If I put my hand in my jacket to grab a cigarette butt, they say that I grabbed a gun." He described constant harassment. "I can't walk nowhere because they stop me. If I'm just walking down the street, they can't just stop me and say, 'I want to see your ID.' They say, 'I got probable cause to search you.'" He described an incident when he ran from police. He was unarmed. They caught me. They took my jacket and put it over my head, kicked me in the head, split my head open. I had probably 38 staples in my head. They shattered every rib on my left-hand side. A homeless white male in his 40s described harassment by APD officers that also included property destruction. When the interviewer asked whether local police had ever abused him, he explained, yeah, once the cops handcuffed me and made me watch them cut up my tent and sleeping bag with razor blades. They're real bastards. When the interviewer asked why APD did that, he responded, because they can, because I'm homeless. 2 homeless Native men and 1 homeless Native woman in their 40s described an APD attack on a friend who was also homeless. According to all 3, officers dragged their friend into an alley where he was beaten. They did it because he's homeless and Native, and they continue to do it, explained the woman. The interviewer asked if APD harassed them. Yeah, the police cut up our IDs and social security cards. They described frequently receiving citations for loitering. They come up and give us a ticket for loitering. We go to court but can't pay, and we end up getting a warrant. We go to jail and get out in the morning. They describe this as a pattern that happened frequently. A homeless Native male and military veteran described being beaten by APD officers who stopped him while he was walking down the street. They asked for an ID. When I reached for it, they slammed me to the ground. The attack knocked out a tooth. A homeless Hispanic man described waiting for a bus at the Alvarado Transit Center when an officer approached him and threw him to the ground. The man landed on his face. The officer handcuffed him while he lay on the ground bleeding. He was arrested for criminal trespass. He explained to ABQ Justice investigators that APD stereotypes homeless people. APD officers charged a white male for panhandling at the Family Dollar. He told ABQ Justice investigators that a police officer handcuffed him and then hit him in the face. And now I'm going to get a $500 fine for something I didn't do. A group of homeless Hispanic men and women described a pattern of police harassment to investigators. Officers confiscate the signs they use to ask motorists for help. 2 of the groups said that police often arrest homeless people who carry backpacks. They denied claims by city officials that some homeless refuse services. Joy Junction is filled with bed bugs. I would give anything to have a pillow to put my head on, a bed. I would also like to say that we talked to a group of homeless in Robinson Park who actually named 2 officers, gave us their man numbers, and told us that these 2 go around every day and beat homeless people. Their names were Carmen and Jerome. And I think Andy wanted to say something as well. Do you want to say something about this numbers?
Sorry, 1 second.
That's all in here. Have you read this?
To start with, the officers that Kathy mentioned, one of them is named Jerome Jaramillo. His man number is 543. The other one, the folks we talked to didn't know her last name. Her first name is Carmen. Her man number is 086, just for the record. Multiple people told us that they have a long history, that they're notorious in Albuquerque for attacking homeless people. What I wanted to say, I just wanted to say a few words about something that really stuck out to me while we were collecting the testimonies, and that's the segregation in the city of Albuquerque, which I had been shamefully more or less unaware of before we started doing this. As Kathy mentioned, most of the testimonies that we collected, or a big chunk of them, we did in the Pennsylvania and Central area, what the city wants us to call the International District, what the people who live there call the war zone. And nearly every single person we saw was either Hispanic or Native or both. It was very, very, very uncommon for us to encounter white people in that area of the city. And every single person we spoke to, every single one, had a story of being abused by the police. There were many, probably about 60 to 75% of them declined to tell us the story. They would say things like, if I tell you that, they will kill me. But every single person said, oh yeah, the cops mess with me all the time. Oh yeah, that's happened to me. It was also shocking the amount of police presence in the area. It felt like it was under occupation. It feels like it's under occupation. If you go there right now, you will certainly encounter, in less than 5 minutes of walking around in that area of town, you will see the police. And where I live, close to the university area, that's not true. I never see the police. I drive 15 miles over the speed limit every time I go anywhere without any fear of getting pulled over because there aren't any cops anywhere, and it's mostly white. And I just, that really stuck out to me, that the segregation in the city, I don't know what the statistics are or if there are statistics, but it's very, very clear from being there that this is a serious, serious problem in the city of Albuquerque.
Just real quick announcement, there's a silver blazer, it's blocking a gate. Anybody? Silver blazer. It's like a silver SUV. Yeah, I would assume, but the truck can't get out. He's gonna get out.
Are the Asians harassed?
You know, we didn't collect a lot of data from Asians. The question was if the police also harass Asians in the city. We didn't collect a lot of data. I think there's a large, specifically Vietnamese community in Albuquerque, but that wasn't exactly the area. I think they're concentrated more to the north of where we were collecting the testimonies. But that is an excellent question, and hopefully we're going to continue collecting these testimonies, and I think that would be a great area to focus on, so thank you.
So now two advocates for the settlement that has become iconically known as Tent City will give an overview. Dinah Vargas and Steve Kramer.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dinah Vargas. I am with ABQ Justice and co-founder of BurkaMedia.com. It's the home of The Second Story. It's a small community grassroots collective of just people telling our own stories, such as these. In the United States Department of Justice report, I remember reading something along the lines of that the Albuquerque Police Department will kill you even if you pose no actual threat to anybody but possibly yourself. And this was taken during last week, headed to one of our encampments, and there's 7 officers or law enforcement, 2 of them the Albuquerque Police Department, surrounding one individual who is sitting down on a bench, a public bench, not a private bench. And this is an everyday reality in the city of Albuquerque. Specifically with the homeless community that we have been giving outreach to and really just providing community, that's what we have done. We have acknowledged who they are as individuals because we find that to be very important to the spirit and the soul. And with providing community and equally becoming community with many members of the encampments 1 through 4, many have complained about the identification cards, and that is just another way that the Albuquerque Police Department can oppress them and keep them poor. So if they take their IDs and all of their documents, or let's say they have 1, maybe 2, maybe 3, if they don't have an actual ID card or driver's license, they can't get things such as a food box. So then, you know, we see people on the street corner and they're flying a sign. Apparently that's the term for it. And then they get arrested for that. They go to jail. And because part of the booking process, you have to give an address. You can't move forward from that process until you give an actual address. So along the lines, it's going to be like, well, give me an address because we can all remember an address. So they give an address. Then the court paperwork goes through the mail and it goes to that address and it's not going to them. And then you get a warrant and then it just starts this vicious cycle. There are people on the streets completely oppressed over a warrant for flying a sign. And did 3 months in jail, completed probation, and I guess failed to pay a $75 probation fee. And this is like a 3-year-old warrant. So the whole time she's not really applying for housing, trying to dodge this, you know, this meaningless warrant because it's our poverty within their pockets. They're being the government. And so I took many members to city council from Tent City, and I was asking the city, you know, I'm not understanding why we as a community can't do something that we can be proud of instead of be ashamed of, because in any event, we are acting. So we are acting shamefully, or we are acting like a strong community, or even just decent people at the end of the day. And so during that time, Steve Kramer was collecting thoughts and input from the communities of Tent City for a proposal for a tent city, because we thought that in doing this, perhaps if we did the work of what they should have been doing, maybe that might ease the process. And if we can have a mock camp that sort of demonstrated what we proposed, that the city would perhaps see something in a different light. And I was telling Steve, and we're in the middle of the camp, and this is like day 3 of not going home, not taking a shower, and people giving us food at the end of the day because they thought we were residents there. And I said, what's the big deal? We're not asking them for anything. Like, we have a plan that would pay them. All we need is like a piece of dirt to start off with. And he said, well, he was like, I think we are asking them for a whole lot. We're asking them to acknowledge that homeless people actually exist, and I think that's by design. So if we even just take the language itself, from even members of the CIT, which is a crisis intervention team, and the COAST team, which is a crisis outreach and support team, which is funded by out of the Albuquerque Police Department's budget, and their sergeants are actual officers. They provided no outreach. What they provided was threats, intimidation. Even when they give tickets for trespassing, it's made out to the color of the tent. But when you're poor and you don't have a lot of resources, or you're homeless and you're just simply tired because the whole day you're just basically trying to survive, that's pretty intimidating to find something, and then, because you know what happens at the end of the day. And so they try to have these sorts of threats that are meaningless. Again, I mean, who's gonna go to court? The tent? And it just makes no sense. That's not outreach, and that's definitely not community policing, because at the end of the day, this still remains what community policing is. And that's all I have, because I think I'm out of time.
I don't have a whole lot to add to that, but my name is Steve Kramer, and I'm with Albuquerque Justice as well. And we've been spending quite a bit of time in the tent cities. And I just wanted to go over recently, because, a lot of people said, well, what is the connection? Well, most people in this room understand the connection. The homeless are targeted sort of as a non-stop proposition when it's convenient for the officers. And when they do need help, or when there is things that need to be addressed, APD's nowhere in sight. And that, I've spent enough time on the ground to really understand that that's the case. They'll drive around all day, but they won't assist, or they won't intervene when there's legitimate reason to intervene. But they will when it sort of suits their fancy, or they want to teach someone a lesson, or like exert their authority. And recently we had a gentleman from the camp that he was going to Santa Fe that day to pick up, I think, his IRS return, income tax return. And he had gotten a ride down to the train station and had been there for a matter of moments, like 2 minutes. He plugged in his phone, and 2 bike cops rode up and said, what are you doing? And he was like, what do you mean, what am I doing? Like, I'm going to Santa Fe. And he goes, no, what are you doing up on that hill? And they said, this is my F city, and you're not going to do that here. And so they're being, I'm not saying this is a citywide problem, but there are officers targeting people currently right now for being a part of the community up on the hill that we're trying to sort of get going and to try to get the city to fall in on. And, everywhere, like, I've spent enough time out there that, like, there's just no rights. Like the police treat the homeless as if they have no rights at all. And after 5 or 6 years of living like that, you tend to forget that you do have those rights. And even if you have them, do you exert them? Do you have the power to exert them? And in a lot of ways, it's just easier to go along sometimes. And I just want to speak a little bit about, the things like the ID. Like this gentleman, for instance, was let out on Wednesday morning, I believe. and he can't pick up his ID. They didn't give him his ID back at all, which is very common. It's a very common theme. But he had $23 on him that he was using to go up to Santa Fe to pick up that check. Well, you can only pick up your money Monday to Tuesday, 9 to 2. So if you're let out on Wednesday morning and you had 40 bucks on you, what are you doing? I mean, and then more to the point, they're going to give you a debit card that's loaded with fees, and I think it's like $1.98 or $2 every time they use it. So if we're starting with $23 and you use it a handful of times and you've used up half of it, I actually obviously understood it to be a problem, but I never understood what a huge problem it is. And we've been lucky where we're at currently because the state troopers have been fairly decent and have respected the people's sort of space. UNM police were there yesterday and were terrible. I mean, in a way that even the news was commenting back on, like, I mean, they were just really out of hand and had no right to be there on top of it. But the point behind the tent cities, and I think this is an important, like, this is the whole reason to try to do them, and it's to get these people into a community so that they can start establishing solidarity and community amongst themselves and grow that strength. So when they leave, they feel empowered on the street, and, like, you know, we're having Know Your Rights seminars and these kind of things. Not to the point, I mean, at the end of the day, you're in a position you're in and you have to judge how much you push. But just like reminding people, and now that there's cameras in camp, it's really changed the behavior of anyone, especially the officers that come on the site. As soon as they see homeless people, raise cameras. And I mean, we can't do it right now, but we're working like over time to get all the non-housed people that want to participate to do this, because it changes behavior immediately, almost as if we're there. And then just briefly and quickly, well, time is up. So briefly and quickly, you know, people are always asking how to help, and I just want to say, like, being an advocate, like, one-on-one, because I had a gentleman go to Human Services to get some paperwork that was rightfully his. It was insurance paperwork. And they basically treat him poorly because they can. And then as soon as I go, and, you know, I'm one step away myself, but I'm there, and as soon as I'm there, he gets his paper, no issues. So a lot of the problems facing the non-housed population are just innate obstacles that we're creating. And, like, we can stop that by actively participating with them as community, but not like passively. I mean, actively being there and advocating and being a part of it, because then it reminds everybody that, no, you can't treat people this way, whether that's the APD or whether it's service providers or whatever. And the proposal is here. The city has this. It's gotten some traction. If you support it, it'll be out here. It's in draft form. It's meant to have feedback. But we need people calling their city councils, especially council at this moment, because that's where it's at. And that's it. Thank you all.
I think Steve, Dinah, the panelists might have some questions for you.
I was wondering if you could, because I think this is really at the very root of police disregard and brutality. Can you address the whole thing about cutting up IDs and social security cards and making the homeless people dehumanized, a non-person, and how that gives the police and the city permission to mistreat them?
Well, yeah, I think that you know, just the process of cutting up an ID is almost as if a person doesn't matter. And a lot of people, you know, they just blend because people look right through them or they look away. And like I said, because we were actively on the camps and stuff, after a while people like stopped looking at me, and I know Steve had experienced that too. And that in itself is really hard, because then you start becoming detached from that sort of thing, and that's sort of why tent cities or communities of homeless residents here or anywhere collectively go in those. And more to the point is, if you don't have an ID, you know, then, you know, when a police officer says, well, where's your ID? And I don't know, do we have to show them that ID or don't we? Well, at the end of the day, we don't. But when you're homeless and you're poor and they know you don't have resources, they are going to violate your rights from like the very minimal to up to and including death on the anniversary of James Boyd. And so we know that to be true and to be factual. And so, you know, not having your identification, we all know when we've lost an ID that the hassle we go through. And we, you know, most have a car, we drive there, we get out, and it could just happen. But for those experiencing homelessness, they have to go to different places to help them to get that, because then they need another supporting document to say that they can get the ID. And then the whole, you know, community food boxes that they give out, or anything to do with housing or food, the basic rights that every individual should have, human right, is completely taken away because you don't have an ID. What'd you do with your ID? Well, the cop cut it up. So you're telling me the cop cut it up? Yeah, I'm telling you the cop cut it up. And that's the conversation, and I'm like, the cop cut it up. Give them some food, you know? And it's food, and it's not like it's a loan or any kind of process like that. So it's very dehumanizing, and it's more to control, because abuse comes in an array of ways. And so if you're habitually not having your ID because the same officer habitually cuts it up or it gets destroyed or whatever, or they throw your tent in a city trash can that we fund, by the way, you know, then they know they can hassle you on that. They can stop you because you're not going to say, I don't have to give you my ID. I mean, you can say that, but at the end of the day, I've exercised my rights discretionally, because at the end of the day, I didn't want to get beat down because of the location or circumstance that I was in. So the ID in itself poses many problems.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's truly an honor to be standing in front of you today. I want to just mention one thing before I read the testimony that I'm here to give. You know, when you call the city of Albuquerque, the mayor's office, to talk to them about Tent City, their standard response is, those people don't want help. And I tell them, they do not want the help you are offering, as though they have to accept the help you are prescribing for them rather than the help they need or want, which if you asked them, they would be able to tell you. I think the fundamental issue that is raised by the Tent City people is they are acting autonomously. And this system will not tolerate autonomy unless you're pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, which is the sort of concept everybody in America has sold. Oh, be individuals, stand up, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But when you say no to the authorities, whether it's, I don't want to give you my ID, or I don't want that help, I don't want to go to the shelter and be woken up at 4 in the morning, they recognize that you are resisting, and they do not like it. So I'm going to now read the testimony here. Albuquerque Justice investigators spoke in January 2015 to a Hispanic woman and former prostitute in her 40s. She described a violent 2008 encounter with an APD officer. She was stopped by a police officer who told her a warrant was out for her arrest, but he wouldn't arrest her if she helped him procure drugs. She refused, telling ABQ Justice investigators, "Why would I admit to knowing where to score crack?" The officer handcuffed the woman and placed her in his squad car, drove her to an empty parking lot. It was dusk. He removed the handcuffs, placed the woman in the front seat of the police cruiser, and offered her a pint of vodka. He then again asked for drugs, and she again refused. He then said that if she wanted to avoid jail, she would have to have sex with him. When she refused, he raped her. 4 days later, the woman reported the rape to 2 APD officers who took her to the Rape Crisis Center. She told ABQ Justice investigators that she was too frightened at that time to give the name of the officer to investigators. They arrested her on a warrant violation. Former APD officer Sam Costales found this story credible, telling ABQ justice investigators that he reported a case of an APD officer who demanded sex from a woman during traffic stops. Quote, I went to internal affairs and I told them this officer is pulling over women, and he told them that if they gave him oral sex, he'd let them go. I went to internal affairs and reported this cop. The detective said it's her word against a cop's. They didn't do anything about it. This went on. They started receiving more and more complaints about this. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Darcy Brazen. Hi, my name is Darcy Brazen, and I have been thinking about and being active about this issue for about 10 years. Do we want to wait for a moment? Oh, sure, thanks. I think what people might not be aware of is that the first sustained series of protests against the police in Albuquerque happened when a group of queer women and lesbians gathered at the Copper Lounge from 2001, November of 2001 to about July of 2002, protesting this kind of extra legal violence that we're talking about. The women weren't targeted by the cops, but were targeted by bouncers from Copper Lounge who beat them up. And can everybody hear? When that was reported, there was no response from the cops. And it kind of galvanized the community. And so 70 or so people came every Thursday to protest at the Copper Lounge, and people got arrested for chalking on the sidewalk. The police came and brought a big banner that covered that sort of, you couldn't see the Copper Lounge, but we were being photographed in front of that banner, almost as if they were photographing us for other things to be inserted wherever, because there was no background to the photographs. So that went on for about 8 months. And then some of the first folks to be arrested when the cops unleashed on protesters in March of 2003 were some of those same lesbians of that group. The police recognized them as leaders as they were unleashing horses, tear gas, and rubber bullets on protesters in March of 2003. So that was my first introduction to the cops, was them not really responding to violence against citizens. And the only demand of those women protesting was diversity training for the bar staff, so it was kind of a slight demand. We sat down with those cops here and there, and I stopped doing that when I realized that I was in negotiations with Ed Sauer. Lieutenant Ed Sauer shot Larry Harper out of a tree at Elena Gallegos in 1995. So that was kind of a shocking thing to realize, that I was in negotiations with a killer. Police don't just police for criminal behavior. Police us to be on the status quo. Police are policing us to know that police want to know that, police are policing gender by noting whether you're a man or a woman, that you're behaving in these ways that are appropriate to your sex. And as I reviewed some complaints, they're all from 2010. Thank you, Silvio DeAngelo, for providing those. We see that how this happens through some of the language. And one of the most prominent things that the cops seem to be kind of obsessed with men that they encountered was dress. And some of the comments included, "Why are you wearing skinny jeans? Are you a fag?" And there were several kind of complaints like that. Women, of these 21 complaints, I'll just kind of review as much as I can what's in them. 3 women reported police looking down their shirts. 3 people reported missing property from the police. 4 cops of 21 complaints did not provide their names when asked. Here are some of the comments. "If a bird shits in a car, I'm coming for you. Don't fucking move. I'll put you on your fucking face." At least 5 of the complaints, although I'm not clear what the nut of it was, that they didn't sort of define why they define the cops' motivations as racially motivated, but a number of people believe that the cops' motivations were racial in their stop. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. My computer died, so I have my handwritten notes. Every one of those complaints, though, did not start out with, all the complaints involved use of force, but that is not what seemed to be the grit of the complaint, nor what the complaints usually started with. People were really surprised by the profane language. And so 21 complaints, 11 reported profane language, derogatory comments, rudeness, and 6 more reported shut up. And Dermo Reeves reported that the police told him to shut up, boy. He's African American. And although of these complaints, the use of force was not substantiated in any of them, many of the complaints, and this is Schultz reviewing these complaints, did sustain the use of, profanity or bad language, being rude to that person. And in the shut up boy complaint, the officer investigating used the Urban Dictionary to substantiate that this use of boy was a derogatory use of it. So it's kind of funny how they investigate their own complaints. People seem to, the first complaint I read was by Fred Maribel. Fred Maribel is homeless. He was asked to leave the park, and all that Fred wanted, and all that he said in his complaint, he referenced City Ordinance 10.11.10, the right to the peaceable enjoyment of parks. I think that's all I have to say in general. Are there questions?
You indicated that there was some property taken. Do you know what the property was?
Money.
Money, okay. Also, you spoke about profane or lewd language. What kind of abusive name calling? Do you know any of the terms used?
Well, I heard the term fag was reported. Often people used adjectives and didn't necessarily report the language, but overwhelmingly people reported that the cops told them very forcibly to shut up before they could even, really tell their story or what was going on. And this included in situations of stress, like car accidents. The cop was like, shut up.
So it wasn't necessarily involving a situation at a bar or anything. If they suspected a person was gay or lesbian, even in a regular civil concourse, they were discriminated against because of their sexuality. Is that what you're trying to get across there?
I think probably people are discriminating against other sexuality. It's more like a weapon that the cops use against you, right? It's not clear to me that the guy in skinny jeans was indeed gay, but it's a weapon that the cops use to put you in your place, right? Are you a fag? You're wearing skinny jeans. So there's a kind of gender policing going on, and the cops are very much involved with that. Thank you for your time, and thank you very much to the committee.
Before we carry on, can I just make an announcement, please? We are trying to build community here, and the community also includes little ones, and after a while they get a little bit tired of all the talking. So if we could please ask that all the speakers then really get into the microphone, not too closely because I apparently did that earlier, but just really try and project. And if you can't hear, then just move closer, if you don't mind, okay? And then if the people in the front room are bothering you, close the door, okay? So we obviously want to hear what people have to say, that's part of it, but everyone is welcome. So the next part is the patterns of police violence against people with mental health care needs. And even though we know this is a very definite omission from the various official reports, we do not have specific testimony that will introduce this part. We have only just started this process, so we know that eventually we will get more testimony, but we didn't want to fabricate and force something. So we know that it is definitely part of the problem, but forgive us, we just don't have anything specific to report. So, Karen Cathay.
Thank you, Elsa, for talking about children being welcome. I'm from La Raza Unida Party, and our organization is a third party, but also our organization includes family. My children were present when we went to meetings. They were present at protests. They were present at everything. So that it's real important to have young people around, even if they may get tired at some point, and maybe if they might be a little loud or laughing. Laughter should be welcomed. I heard him laughing back there. So I was asked to talk about the patterns of police violence against people with mental health care needs. I have a family member that has encountered police encounters as, it's not easy as a young man to live in the International District, being brown, having to also carry yourself as you keep your head high, and you might end up being in a gang just because of the culture that you live in, because of the area you live in, because of social determinants. So my family member that I have, he was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. So people carry themselves different. And it's really interesting because when I am with him, we've gone down the street and it's like, because they have been given CIT training, they know how to figure out, well, which ones are the ones that have mental health care issues. They know, that's why they have CIT training. So, and also in that CIT training, they're supposed to be able to de-escalate. They are given steps, what to do. But I don't know if APD, as each individual officer, if they internalize that information and so be oppressive to that person that has mental health care issues, or if they are truly being compassionate and remembering their training. I watched a man the other day on Louisiana near Bell. He was walking, pacing back and forth. And guess what? There was a police officer getting ready to go back to Southeast Command. And he spotted him right away. And you could tell he probably had some kind of mental health issues. So guess what? 2 more police cars come up. And I don't know what happened because I didn't stick around to see what happened in this situation. But that is showing that, yes, they do profile if you have mental health illness. They don't only profile you for that, but being a young person, just being brown, being young, having a tattoo. There are so many things. But for mental health, look at James Boyd. I met him 8 days before he was murdered. My grandson, who was laughing back there, and I went to the mountains to go and see the stars at night. And we ran into James Boyd. He asked me a question. It was something like, so what do you think if I built a fort up here? Mom, that'd be kind of cool. And I was not scared of him. I was not scared of him at all. And I don't see, there's something about fear. Like, to me, I think police, this is just my opinion, and I know some people might not agree with it, but there's your limbic system, right? There's a flight or flight. And I think a lot of people get into that flight and fear, even an APD officer. They are so scared of the mentally ill because they don't know what's going to happen. Or there's this connotation out there with the movies, with the way life is, that people with mental illness, oh my God, they're going to just lose it. They're going to lose it on me. And it's not true. They're just as compassionate as us. You need to be aware of triggers, yes, but you can de-escalate the situation, and that's what they're supposed to be trained in, to be able to de-escalate. But I don't think they take that seriously. And yes, there are quotas. There are quotas. And I live in the International District, and I see people get pulled over. I see the colonization that's happened among Native peoples. I see everything that we've talked about here.
I just wanted to ask, what's the likelihood that having an aggressive authority figure like the police in like a mental crisis situation, what's the likelihood that that will actually escalate the situation or worsen it?
You know, just watching, if you're really trained and if you really consider your training, you can de-escalate the situation. Like, I remember Vincent Wood, I guess he was another person that was murdered by APD, and he had mental illness. I don't remember how the case went, but when I watch, you know, for me, I can go, like, the other day I was at Tent City, the second Tent City, and one of the residents, she was having a meltdown, and all I did was just listen to her. And after a while, she was fine. You never say, oh, I understand. You never, ever say, I understand, because you don't understand what they're going through. What's going through their head is what they really believe. So you just need to listen to them.
I was, Karen, I was wondering if you have ever observed a situation where the officer was actually trying to stimulate some reaction from the person that they were dealing with.
You know, I watched the gang unit just across from my house, and I watched them. They do intimidate people. They try their hardest to intimidate. They say, oh, so what's that on your hand? Just with just people that don't have mental illness. Just imagine if that person had mental illness.
Hi, my name is Sam Costales. A little bit of background. I was a police officer for a total of 24 years with the Albuquerque Police Department. I only have so much time to talk, but you want me to describe several of my stories. I have so many stories that take me hours to describe the amount of brutality I've witnessed by my fellow officers. Early on, when I was just released from the academy, I was given a training officer, and we're working in the downtown area of Albuquerque. And we had a call where a homeless man was sleeping in front of a business. And it was the middle of the winter, so my training officer said, we're going to go, I'll let you handle this call. And you go ahead and you handle it from the start to finish. I said, okay. So I was trying to wake the guy up and say, hey, you need to move on along your way. And finally, he got frustrated with the way I was handling the call. And he said, no, let me show you how you handle this call. So he put his foot on the homeless person's ankle. He took out his PR-24, which is a nightstick, and he held it like you would a golf club, and he hit the guy as hard as he could in the bottom of the foot. And the guy stood straight up with immense pain. And he said, that's the way you wake up the homeless. I was like, I came from a nursing background, so I was like, Jesus Christ, what did I get myself into? So over the next 20 years, I worked from October of 1981 to October of 2001. I did exactly 20 years. I had witnessed so much brutality over that time that I just wanted to get out of it. I mean, and it's a job, so you sort of have to provide for your family. So that's why many officers won't come forward and say what they saw. Now, I never hit, kicked, slapped, punched anybody because that wasn't the way I did business. I treated people with respect and I listened to them. And that's how I maintained my way of doing it. But I was just as guilty as the rest of them because I remained silent when it came to all the brutality I witnessed. So I'm no angel, you know. I just kept quiet for my own well-being. There's many, I mean, the times that I witnessed, it was over and over and over again. And I tell people all the time, yes, be afraid of the police and know that they do have the right to shoot you, which they will do. But more so, be afraid of them taking your liberties away because the power of arrest is a dangerous power for these people to possess. And that is abused on a daily basis. It's abused for the numbers that we need to get because we have to arrest so many drunks, we have to arrest so many felons, and so we'll seek those out. And we'll get them by whatever means necessary to get them. And including drunks, I mean, we'd sandbag bars and wait for them to come out stumbling to the car, which is against the law to let a drunk get into a car and wait for them to pull out, and then we'd pull out and get them. Tickets. You know, we had a quota on tickets. That went on all the time, and we fudged the numbers in order to meet those quotas sometimes. But I would watch officers arrest a person on a felony charge that, I'll give you a quick story about it. A man's driving down the freeway, I-40 westbound. He and his wife get in an argument. She gets so upset that she tries to jump out of the vehicle. So she opens the door and she tries to jump out. He sees the exit sign for Carlisle and a state police sign. So he said, I'll pull in there. So he holds onto her arm and he pulls into the state police parking lot. Of course, they're not going to take the call because it's an Albuquerque call. So they call us. I go with another officer, and I'm the backup officer. When we arrive, we go inside. I talk to the male. He explained exactly what I just told you, and he talked to the female. And this guy was known for having high felony clearance rates. So he walks up and he said, well, he's under arrest. I said, what's he under arrest for? He was keeping her from committing suicide. And he goes, well, he held her against her will. I said, are you not getting this? He's keeping her from jumping out of the vehicle. He goes, it's a good felony. The DA will drop it anyway, and I get the credit. This is where the arrests come from. It's on and on and on, repeated over and over again. This is what I witness all the time. False arrest, where they arrest a man for domestic violence. I talked to one guy, I talked to the man, and he talked to the woman. Never even talked to the man. He walks up to me, this different officer, and said, he's under arrest for domestic violence. I said, no, he explained the whole situation. You really need to listen to this guy because he was trying to leave the house, and his wife prevented him from doing so, and he just pushed her aside a little bit just to leave the house. And he arrested him for domestic violence, for battery on a household member. I can go on and on. I just don't have the time, but.
Specifically, can you speak about how training gives them the paradigm to do these kinds of things?
The training we're taught, when a police officer is taught, we're taught to make a decision. Now, it could be the right decision, it could be the wrong decision, but once you make that decision, you will not go back on that decision. So even though you're wrong, you've been proven wrong, you've been shown to be wrong, you will not back down from that decision because you want to be right. And the same goes with apologies. How many times have you heard a cop say, "I'm sorry for something," or "I've made a mistake"? We were told in the academy, never show the people your weakness. That's showing a weakness. When you say, "I apologize," you're showing that you're a weak cop. And that's carried through your career.
What takes place as far as training is concerned? Are they trained to use specific abusive or excessive forms of force?
No. That's taught by the training officers. Because once you get to a training officer, he's going to say, forget everything you learned in the academy, because I'm going to show you how to be a cop.
So the training, once they get out of the academy?
Once they get the training officer will show you their way of being a police officer. And that's sort of carried on.
So they are trained to be excessive?
Yes.
Okay.
Because you have to pass your training officer. So you have to do everything they want you to do in order to pass that training officer.
You're very unusual for speaking out like this, and I commend you for doing it. I am curious. We often hear about that there are good cops. Some people go so far to say that most of the cops are good.
I absolutely disagree with that. I'll give there's the majority of cops are bad cops. I will tell you that because, well, let's say when I came out and I testified for the defense in the Al Ernster case, every cop turned against me. Now, if there was good cops, I mean, they didn't even want to be a part of me because I sort of guilt by association. So they backed away from being with me too. But the majority of cops, it's almost like a peer pressure. They'll jump in. It's almost like a shark frenzy, an eating frenzy, where if they see somebody jump on a guy and they start beating them, then they jump in too. And that's what I tell my son-in-laws, because now I got two son-in-laws who are cops. So I tell them, I said, that's what you need the strength for. You need to hold yourself from participating in those reindeer games of jumping in, beating on people. I said, your job's to arrest. Once you arrest, that's it. That's your job. Your job's not to issue punishment. Your job's not to take things personally, no matter what they say to you. You're not supposed to smack, you're not supposed to say F words to people and stuff like that. I said the word pissed once, and I was written up for it. And I hear cops all the time saying, F this, get on the effing ground. That's not the way we're supposed to be above that, but we're not.
So intimidation is a routine
Intimidation is
training.
A big part of it, yeah.
On a personal level, are you personally at risk for being here or for speaking out?
Well, I was just talking I have 3 Facebook friends who are police officers, and they don't really, all she told me, I visited her the other day, and she said, all my friends are cops, and I just want to let you know you need to be very careful with what you just did. So, I don't know. I mean, I'm more fearful of arrest than I am of them killing me, but...
Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about, you talked a little bit about training and how the police officers are trained to be aggressive. In that training, is there also, and I'm not really sure the right way to put it, but is there sort of maybe an okay, these certain populations, for example, certain attitudes
yes.
Come through maybe about homeless folks or maybe
yes.
about women or people of color.
Yes.
And can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, anyone who doesn't know their rights, anyone who's not aware, so if you're stopped as a homeless person on 4th and Central versus a person being stopped up in Tanawon, you're going to be completely treated totally different. I mean, there's 2 types of policing, and that's for the homeless people. And, I had many, many dealings with the homeless people, but most of them you know, we got along, I will say. You get to know them, you get to talk to them. And if you listen to anybody, they have a story why they're homeless. But they were treated a lot differently. They just were treated second-class citizens, pure and simple as that. You know. And Boyd, when it comes to Boyd, he was doing what most cops want people to do. Get on the outskirts of town and not bother anybody, not panhandle. That's what he was doing. He was minding his own business. And they sought him out to give him a hard time and eventually kill him. So yeah, the homeless, the minorities are treated different. Do we profile? Absolutely, we were told to profile. At the end of the month, if I didn't have my 40 tickets, we said, go stop the Mexican nationals because you know you have at least 3 tickets out of them. And you know they're not going to show up, so they get a warrant, then you can go back and get them on the warrant, on and on. So we did profile.
Would you say that before an officer opens the patrol vehicle's door, that they're going into that vehicle with disdain and disregard in their heart for the citizenry?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe police officers in general, when they become a police officer, I think the majority of them want it for the power of the badge and the gun and the authority. When I lived here all my life, when I became a police officer, I wanted to become a police officer because I respected the police. I said, I want to be part of my city, and I want to step forward and wear a badge and a gun, but I want to do so as an ally with my citizens, not as an authority over my citizens. And that's how I sort of went through my career, treating people with respect and kindness and listening to people. And that's what I find that most of the cops don't do. They don't care what you have to say. They're just on a power trip, as far as I'm concerned.
On that note, actually, I was wondering, I don't know if you've ever given any thought to it, but maybe if you could talk about possibly other forms of policing that that we might implement, or maybe talk a little bit about community policing. Like, what would it look like if for you we changed things to be the way that it should be?
Well, if they go back to community policing and you go back to protect and serve versus this us versus them mentality that they have now, and it's sort of been perpetuated with the militarized vehicles, equipment, the dress that they have. I've never been a fan of SWAT, never have. From day one, I never wanted to be a SWAT team member. I never liked them. They're arrogant. They think they're better than every other cop. I mean, they talk down to other police officers. And they're no better than any of us, but, you know, they thought I just never wanted to be part of a SWAT team or have them at my calls. And it's sort of arbitrary when they call in SWAT because it's just up to the officer, really, if they call in a SWAT team to handle something. And I witnessed that over and over again where they'd call for no reason at all. I mean, I had the call handled, and they said, no, we need to call in SWAT. Then SWAT would come in and destroy the person's house, break all the windows out of the house, fill the house with tear gas, and that's the way they resolved it, when I could have resolved it peacefully.
So you're saying that the militarization of the police force is overtly and intentionally to intimidate and suppress us?
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you feel like there's a culture of hate within the department, or is that just learned behavior? Because I know a lot of police officers are Hispanic, and do they feel like they need to perpetrate hate of their own people, or
well,
minorities in general, or?
Once they put on the uniform, it's more like they're all blue at that time, and there's no more Hispanic or black or white or anything else. That's what they try to say, but I mean, they turn on each other just as quickly. Oh, sorry. Sure. Well, there's key phrases that cops will say. I was in fear for my life. You heard that over and over again. Quit resisting. I mean, I witnessed that over. The guy's not resisting. They have his arms pinned underneath him, and they're on top of him with their knees on his back and on his neck. And they tell you, quit resisting, quit resisting. So they're doing that so a show. So when people are hearing this, they're hearing that, oh, the guy was resisting the whole time, when that, in fact, is not the case. I need to go home, every day. And what I keep telling people is that, okay, this is not a draft. You volunteered to be a police officer. Nobody made you become a cop. And there's a chance you won't come home. But, when you put a bulletproof vest on and a badge on every day and you carry a gun, there's a chance you're not going to come home, and that's the risk you're going to take. But it's gotten to the point to where I need to go home to my family at all costs. And at all costs means at the cost of you. So, yeah, it's I don't know.
Thanks, Sam.
Hello, I'm Bill Bradley, and I'm going to do the summary of the findings. First of all, it's been a very powerful tribunal, and I've been truly moved. Thank you to all the organizers. Thank you to the expert witnesses, the tribunal panelists, and all of the audience for spending a beautiful Saturday afternoon here. What we're doing here is organizing another step towards social justice for all. If you haven't yet, please sign in, give us your contact information, because, geez. ABQ Justice is just getting started, right? This is a long, long struggle. Many of you have been in this struggle for many, many years. ABQ Justice will continue. Please sign in. There's a sign-in sheet out the front desk by the coffee. And just on a personal note, I'm moving to Philadelphia next week, and I plan to bring this knowledge I learned here today with me into that movement there. There's a very large movement there, as a couple of our, Andrew, I think his name was, came from LA. This is a nationwide struggle. We need to do it that way to really, with the focus, of course, on local police forces, as we're doing here, to really to overcome police violence. So I really encourage you all to take this knowledge and experience back to your local communities. And so the summary of findings. Our investigation confirms many of the conclusions of the investigation conducted by the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, released in April 2014. We find that APD engages in unconstitutional policing and the frequent unjustified use of non-lethal force. In particular, our investigation supports a finding of racial bias and prejudice in policing by APD in 3 areas: violence against people of color, violence against homeless people, and violence against women. We find that APD systematically engages in racially motivated forms of policing. Its officers target people of color, particularly Native Americans. Nearly every Native person we interviewed described APD's use of racial slurs by APD officers. And as you heard before, that was one of the interviews I conducted. Native American folks living on the street told us how the cops cut up their IDs and Social Security cards. The man I was interviewing just asked, rhetorically of course, why do they do this to us? We're humans too. That really stuck with me. All right. And of course, as Melanie pointed out, and what I would like to say, I haven't heard these words, that there is really a low-intensity warfare against natives ongoing here in Albuquerque. And as Melanie pointed out, the disappearance of Native Americans is the goal, and resistance continues. We find that APD targets homeless people and routinely violates their constitutional rights. Our investigation reveals that the Albuquerque Police Department specifically and routinely engages in the harassment of homeless people through the use of intimidation, threats, and frequently unjustified, non-lethal force. The other night while I was visiting Tent City, I spoke with a resident who told me how he was targeted by a cop, arrested because he was homeless and an activist. A double threat. During my interviews over the last few months, I met several homeless people who had participated in the protests after their brother Abba Boyd was murdered. It is inspiring to hear such people organizing and fighting back against the oppressive police state they definitely live in. As a union organizer, I know that when people's anger overshadows their fear and they organize, another world is possible. We find that APD engages in violence against women, including and most troubling sexual violence. These conclusions are confirmed by both street interviews with victims of APD violence and interviews with former APD officers. I interviewed that woman also, as well as other people here, who was described in detail, Barbara described in detail her account of her rape by cop. What wasn't said, that just happened several blocks away from a police substation. So that police officer knew he was safe where he was because silence was going to be upheld, as Sam told us. This woman intelligently dissected the systematic, sexist, racist, and classist oppression that she and her compañeras suffer under. And it also had a very good analysis of the West Mesa murders. Today, she still lives in fear of police retaliation because she spoke up about her rape by cop. The investigation offered 8 expectations that we believe, if implemented, will contribute to addressing the suffering of the people we interviewed for this investigation. It is important to note, however, that these are merely short-term reforms that address immediate issues and only partially address institutionalized racism at APD. We know there will be no end to police and violence until the social, political system they serve is changed or overthrown. But we can move toward these reforms so the people we interviewed and the thousands more living so precariously can breathe easier, can sleep in their tent cities without fear of police violence being visited upon them. Our investigation identified 4 areas where immediate changes at APD are necessary. Those are accountability, transparency, training and recruitment, and lastly, leadership and administration. For better accountability, the new Civilian Police Oversight Agency must have the authority to discipline officers for wrongdoing, and because APD underreports its use of force, it must establish a program of extensive street outreach that sends teams of investigators, much like we did, into the streets to interview the victims of APD violence. The city must decriminalize homelessness and remove from APD the authority to police the homeless. For better transparency, the police department must publish shift rosters of all officers at the end of each week and make lapel cameras video from those officers available immediately. For better training and recruitment, APD must end the hiring of military veterans and instead prioritize those candidates who hold degrees in social service and allied fields. Among current officers, the department must provide tuition reimbursements for officers to pursue advanced degrees in social service fields and financial incentives for those who choose to do so. I would add on, maybe we should just hire a bunch of nurses like Sam was, and that might help out. To improve leadership and administration, APD must end the practice of promoting within its most aggressive units, such as SWAT, K-9, and the Bomb Squad, and instead promote only those officers who hold advanced degrees in social service and allied fields. Finally, it's worth stating, against these changes in policies and practices at APD alone will not solve the problem of racialized police violence. The Albuquerque Police Department has a long history, as Richard described to us, of racialized police violence against the poor, and the city of Albuquerque has an equally long history of turning a blind eye to this history. We offer this report as another tool in our organizers' toolbox with which we can dismantle the prison of all the people interviewed who are languishing in that prison. And with them, these folks that we've been advocating for, we need to organize with, and that is the key. So we can use this report like a sledgehammer and raise it and bring it down hard upon APD police violence, smashing it. Thank you for participating in the support in the historic tribunal. The struggle continues. Now I'd like to turn it over to the panelists. If any of you would like to make a final statement, now would be the time. Thank you.
They arrested me for protesting the mayor's office. I got 2 roller cuff tears. I have 2 rotor cuff tears, 4 herniated discs on my neck. I've got some nerve damage, and I'm 64. I'm Greek, Spaniard, and Piro Indian. So I had already 3 strikes against me in the first place. But right now I'm also an activist. My nephew was shot and killed 25 years ago. So because of that, I needed to let you know that they had no mercy. They had no mercy on any one of us that were there. But they also did something that was uncalled for. They also gave me PTSD. When I was detained at the elevator for 30 minutes, they brought 3 paramilitary police with AK-47s. That's how my nephew was killed. I was so appalled that I turned around and I looked at him straight in the eye. Not one of them could see me straight in my eye. And I told him, don't you shoot me without looking at me in my eye. And they wouldn't. So right now I'm dealing with a lot, but I'm telling you one thing. I will not vary. I will stand tall and I will still fight. And I will not stop. Thank you very much.
Turn it over to the panel for any final statements. And thank you again.
I just want to say thank you to everyone who provided testimony. For me, this was very powerful. I think that it confirms what we've known for many, many years, and the question is, how do we change this, the police department and the way that they operate? And it's not going to change tomorrow. Obviously, it's going to take a long, hard struggle. So I will do what I can to help. And, at some point in time, I think that we will be victorious.
I'd like to draw your attention, I'm not going to make the full statement, but I'd like to draw your attention to a statement that I did make. It's in the appendix. But if I could please, if you would bear with me, I'd just like to read the last 3 paragraphs. Because one thing I want to say is that obviously this paradigm and practice is, from anyone's faith tradition sensitivity, is blatantly immoral. It's blatantly immoral. And so I'd like to, from my faith perspective, I'd like to just make a comment here. First of all, I'd like to just draw attention to what the prophet Micah says. He has told you, O mortal, what is good and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. And so I issue this plea, this appeal to the men and women of the APD. Sisters and brothers, You come from among our own people. You are killing and mistreating your own brothers and sisters. Any human order to kill must be subordinated to the law of God, which says, you shall not kill. No police officer is obliged to obey an order contrary to the law of God when use of non-lethal force or de-escalation or negotiation can resolve the situation and ensue peace. No one has to submit to an immoral culture of violence. I call upon you in the name of God to recover your consciences and to obey your consciences. Practice justice, do kindness, be humble and empathetic among those you have been called to serve and protect. And so, as the church is a defender of the rights of God's people and the teacher of the law of God and the promoter of human dignity, we call upon you to not any longer use this kind of force and immoral treatment of the people who are called, you are called to serve and protect and to love. Thank you.
Other statements?
I'd like to thank all the people who have so courageously and continuously followed this work. It's dangerous work, and I certainly appreciate the way people have stepped out and disregarded their own safety in order to protect the safety of others. I think that we need, I agree with everything in this report. I think it's wonderfully well done. And it just seems to me like we do need to weed out people who join the forces because it's a cover-up for violence that they can participate in violence because they're covered. And the other thing is the idea that people need to have social work or psychiatric training in order to bring to the attention that the people are not the enemy. The people are who they should be protecting. Thank you.
Other panelists, last chance.
I would just like to thank everybody who spoke. I was happy to be here today, and it was very inspiring to hear everything. And I just wanted to also briefly mention that all of these issues that we spoke about in relation to police violence, it's important that when we're talking to people, we do continue to make sure that we point out that these things are all integrated problems. They don't all stand on their own. So once again, thank you to all the speakers.
I also would like to thank ABQ Justice for putting this on, Answer Coalition, and of course the Red Nations, and obviously my fellow panelists. We need to continue working diligently to change a culture of violence within the police department. I myself was a 17-year-old kid and was abused by police officers in 1973 when it was really heavy for Native activists back in those days. But I just wanted to say thank you to everybody, the audience, all the activists. Thank you very much.
So there's still one point of business that we've got to do, but before we get there, quite a few reports have been mentioned, like the Luna Walker report. There's also the Moreland report. There have already been so many different reports done. If the audience were interested in receiving copies of those, we're not going to make hard copies, but we've got digital copies. Please make sure that you sign in. There is a sign-in sheet on the counter where the coffee is. So have a cup of coffee, sign in, and say that you want to receive those reports, and I will send it to you. There are also two other columns on that sign-in sheet. The one is if you want to receive any information about any further events and actions that ABQ Justice is planning. And we're pretty busy at the moment, so you will have a lot of opportunities for activism. And then the third column is if you've by any chance had experiences with APD and you were prepared to testify, what we presented today is a work in progress. We're not going to stop. Like the poor homeless people, we're not going away. So if we can get more testimonies, if you perhaps know of people who do have these horrible stories to tell, or perhaps someone who was treated very well by an APD officer, I mean, that is also hopefully possible, then please just give us your information so that we can make contact with you. Then I also want to point you to a flyer that is also right next to the clipboard. There are actually two events. The one is tomorrow at the Blessed Oscar Ramiro Catholic community, thinking about Boyd. And then on Monday at 6:30 at Copper Canyon, where Boyd was murdered, there is going to be, by the sound of things, a really moving candlelight vigil. So just pick up those flyers as well, and let's just keep on remembering who this man was, and then try and prevent that from happening again. So now the last piece of business is, in this report, and also if you're interested in receiving the report of the preliminary findings, also we can send that to you. But what we want is for, hopefully, the panelists would be prepared to sign formally that you are prepared to work with us to make this report even better so that we can then use it. We're going to use your signatures to show this wasn't just something that we did on our own, but that we are actually getting input from various sectors. So now, closing ceremony, signatures. If anyone's got money, we can always use it. There's a donation box as well. Donation box outside. Put your jacket on. Yeah, no, I grew up in Santa Fe when we used to get snow, real snow. Oh, wow, there you go. It was even worse there.
My instinct is to just high five everybody all the way around. High fives.
Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, it was great.
So are you going to give this to the mayor?
Well, I know that some of the panelists still want to give input. So this phrasing is also very conditional. So it's not that you're signing on the report as it is now. If you were happy to work with us, then eventually, so it's not going to be immediate.
Okay, but at some point?
At some point, yes. So what we've been thinking is to the mayor, to the city councilors, to Balderas, and really try and push us. This, as the Bill said in his summary, it can become a
Yeah, because that's one question that I didn't ask in terms of when it would be, when and who. I mean, I think it should be very, you know, obviously you guys probably have some ideas in terms of how you're going to do it, but, you know, the mayor ought to get a very public. Yeah, yeah. As well as the city council, because I think a lot of the city council members, I think maybe some of them are in the right place, I don't know, but some of them aren't, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good job,
Well,
Charles.
we survived.
Now let's go out and get shot by the cops.
If they have us surrounded.
No, one time the cops arrested my son, and I said, why are you arresting him? It was in my front yard. And you know what they told me? He has a bad attitude. I'm like, really?